While it might not happen as often these days, you would be surprised to learn just how many people have been falsely declared dead only for them to wake up a day or two later. Welcome back, Most Amazing. It's me, your host Kennedy, and today we are talking about what I can only imagine would be equally terrifying for both the supposed to be dead person and the people attending the funeral. So with that in mind, get ready, because these are the top 10 people who woke up in a coffin at their own funeral. Starting us off at number 10 is Matthew Wall. Since 1571, the village of Browing in Herefordshire, England has celebrated Old Man's Day every 2nd of October. And no, it's not just a day to celebrate old men. It all began when a local farmer, Matthew Wall, suddenly died while preparing for his wedding. Or at least he was believed to be dead. On the morning of his funeral, while being carried to the village church in his coffin, one of the pallbearers slipped and accidentally dropped the casket. And good thing too. The shock of the drop awoke Wall from his coma, and he started immediately banging on the coffin and screaming to be let out. Thankfully, the pallbearers heard him, opened the coffin, and saved Matthew from being buried alive. The best part of this is that this one has a happy ending. Matthew Wall went on to get married, have 2 sons, and lived another 24 years. When he died for real, all that he asked was that the church bell be rung on the 2nd day of October every year to commemorate the slip that literally saved his life. Coming in at number 9, a bishop. During the late 19th century, the Greek Orthodox bishop of Lesbos Island, named Nicephorus Glycus, was declared dead on March 3rd, 1896. Now, it's not super clear exactly what the believed cause of death was, but clearly he looked dead enough, and so the funeral began. In accordance with Orthodox tradition, the bishop's body was put in an open casket and set on display at the church, where it was to remain for the next 2 days so that the public could come by to pay their respects. However, to everyone's complete and utter shock, on the second and final night of what is called the exposition of the corpse, the bishop sat up in his coffin, looked around, and reportedly demanded to know what all the fuss was about. Turns out, he had just been taking a super long nap. Coming in at number 8, Fagilyu Mukhametzyanov. A more recent instance of an accidental declaration of death is that of Fagilyu Mukhametzyanov. In 2011, Fagilyu suddenly collapsed in her home following a heart attack and was, of course, quickly rushed to the hospital. However, sadly, shortly after her arrival, she was declared dead. And sadly, from here, the story gets about 100 times worse. As it turns out, the woman was, in fact, alive, as a few days later, when lying in her coffin at her funeral, she awoke, sat up, and nearly made every other person in the room faint from shock. However, it wasn't just her friends and family that were surprised. Once Fagilyu realized what was happening and that she had woken up at her own funeral, she began, understandably, screaming and was promptly rushed back to the hospital by her family. Tragically, however, due to the shock of the entire situation, she only lived an additional 12 minutes in intensive care prior to yet another heart failure. And the second time around, she really did pass away. Coming in at number 7, Rosa Isabel Callaca. On April 26, 2022, Rosa Isabel Callaca was set to be buried following what, at the time, was believed to have been a fatal car crash. Now, it's definitely not every day that this kind of thing happens with the help of modern medicine, so Rosa's case, for me, is one of the most terrifying on this list. In the midst of her funeral procession, mourners carrying her coffin thought their ears were deceiving them after they heard strange knocking sounds coming from inside the coffin. Not really knowing what to expect, when the coffin was opened, no one could believe their eyes when they saw Rosa alive and gasping for air. As soon as it became evident she was alive, the caretaker of the cemetery called police and the family rushed the traumatized woman to the nearest hospital. Initially, Rosa was put on life support as doctors were able to find very faint signs of life. However, sadly, due to many factors, she died only a few hours later. After the incident, Rosa's relatives were understandably outraged that she had been falsely declared dead and sent to the morgue in the first place, and I for one now have a brand new fear. Coming in at number 6, Octavia Hatcher. Back in January of 1891, after the tragic loss of her only son Jacob, Octavia fell into a deep depression and refused to leave her bed. Her husband naturally grew very worried about her, but soon things got even worse. Several weeks later, she became sick, and shortly after that, she fell into a coma. But not understanding what exactly a coma was at the time, by May 2nd, she was officially declared dead. Octavia's service was held immediately, and she was buried at the cemetery. However, a few days later, other people in the town who had also fallen into a coma began to wake. And so James began to worry they had unknowingly buried his wife alive. Panicked, James raced to the grave to dig it up. However, upon opening the coffin, he was horrified to see he was too late. The inner lining was torn and her hands were bloody from trying to escape. Devastated, James reburied his wife and erected a monument for her and their son Jacob. Unsurprisingly, this tragedy made James quite paranoid of being buried alive himself, and so he ordered a custom-made coffin long before his demise, one that could be opened from the inside. God forbid he ever be in the same position as his late wife. Coming in at number 5, Madame Bobin. On November 16, 1901, a local newspaper reported the story of Madame Bobin, who sadly passed away from yellow fever after arriving in France from Senegal. Reportedly, upon her arrival, she was rushed to the hospital. However, her body soon stiffened considerably and her face had turned a ghostly pale. So she was declared dead and promptly buried so as to impede the spread of the yellow fever. However, soon after the burial took place, a nurse reported to authorities that she believed it was premature, as the body had not been terribly cold when she saw her, and she noticed some faint abdominal movements as well. This information was quickly passed on to Madame Bobin's father, who ordered the body be exhumed immediately. Her father, along with the other members of the village, went to the site to see the exhumation. However, to their utter horror and shock, when the casket was opened, there was a newborn inside the coffin with her. As it turns out, Madame Bobin didn't have yellow fever at all. She was likely just suffering some kind of strange complications of her unknown pregnancy. And in the end, her father ended up suing the hospital that declared her dead and was given 8,000 francs as compensation. Coming in at number 4, Mrs. Blunden. You would think waking up in your coffin just once would be a rare enough occurrence. However, for this woman, it happened twice. On July 15, 1674, Mrs. Blunden fell ill and shortly after fell into a deep sleep after having just a bit too much poppy tea. Now, just in case that doesn't mean much to you, it was a common tea that was drunk for its woozying effects. Wink wink. However, in Mrs. Blunden's case, she was believed to have died in her sleep as her body became cold, she stopped breathing, and no one was able to find her pulse. Understandably, she was declared dead and buried. However, not long after she was laid to rest, her body was exhumed after some little ones playing around the graveyard complained of hearing strange sounds coming from her grave. As it turns out, she had been buried alive, as she was found covered in wounds and scratches from attempted escapes. However, as she appeared to show no signs of life, she was once again declared dead and reburied. Tragically, however, she was alive. The next day, the body was exhumed again to allow for a coroner's inspection, and this time she was found with her clothes torn off and a badly bitten bloody lip, neither of which existed after the first time. Coming in at number 3, Elenor Markham. The year was 1894 when Elenor Markham was declared dead in her village of Sprakers, New York. Reportedly, for 2 weeks prior, she had been complaining of heart problems, and her physician, Dr. Howard, kept an eye on her, routinely checking in until the morning of June 8th, when her declining health finally came to a close. Or at least that was what he believed. As of course, it made sense at the time, he issued her a death certificate, and then 2 days later she was placed in a coffin in preparation for a burial. However, to everyone's surprise, while being carried into the transport vehicle destined to take her to the cemetery, Elenor made a noise from inside. Not yet believing what they thought was happening, her coffin was opened and Elenor sat up panicking, saying that she was about to be buried alive. Her doctor, who was nearby, came over right away to calm her down, assuring her that everything would be corrected, and Elenor later stated she had been conscious throughout the entire preparation and had heard everything being discussed. Coming in at number 2, Essie Dunbar. In 1915, 32-year-old Essie Dunbar was declared dead after a brutal epilepsy attack. As was standard procedure, Essie's body was placed in a coffin and slated for a burial in the late morning the following day. Now, originally, they wanted to have her funeral earlier in the morning, however, Essie's sister lived in another town, and so they pushed it to give her more time to arrive. Still, even with the delayed ceremony, Essie's sister didn't make it on time and arrived a few minutes after Essie had been lowered into the ground. This, however, would save her sister's life, as luckily, upon her arrival, they allowed the burial plot to be exhumed so that her sister could pay her respects. However, to everyone's understandable shock, once the coffin opened, Essie shot up in her coffin and smiled right at her sister, causing the 3 nearby ministers to faint and fall into the grave. The sister, believing that Essie was possessed or something, ran off screaming and caused a huge commotion. And the rest of Essie's life, many believed she was some kind of zombie that had returned from the dead. The good news for Essie was that she lived many more years and died for real, peacefully, in 1955. And last up in our number 1 spot, Maggie Dickson. On September 2nd, 1721, Maggie Dickson was awaiting her fate in the gallows after it was found she concealed a pregnancy, something that was a major offense. Reportedly, prior to her sentencing, Maggie had run away from her husband. Now, the exact reason why she was running was never confirmed. Some legends say he was abusive, others that he abandoned her, but either way, she began working at an inn and shortly after took up an affair with the owner's son. This affair led to young Maggie becoming pregnant, but worrying that she would lose her job if anyone found out, she hid the pregnancy from everyone. From here, the details are a bit foggy, as some say she lost the pregnancy during the late stages, while others say the newborn did make it but died shortly after. However, whatever the exact details were, because no one knew of the pregnancy to begin with, Maggie could not hold a funeral, and so she decided to abandon it near the lake. Maggie, however, was caught in the act and arrested. After a traumatic trial, she was found guilty and hanged before being placed in a coffin and transported to a graveyard 10 kilometers away. But in an insane twist of fate, on the ride over, family members heard a knock, opened the lid, and found Maggie alive in her coffin. From that day forward, her resurrection was taken as an act of God, and she was forgiven of her crimes and lived the rest of her life a free woman. Well, there you have it, guys. I hope you liked this one. If you did, make sure to click that subscribe button and let me know in the comments down below any other wild funeral stories. I'll see you next time.